lectures starting last fall, and we're going to be continuing next month in April. We have a lecture coming up on April 6th. It is on pre-colonial Pennsylvania and will be by our own Carter Johnson, who is running tech for us tonight. He'll be sharing with us a glimpse into this region's ecological history. Basically, he'll be giving us a broad discussion of plants, animals, and people who are most prevalent in this area leading up to the colonization of this area in the continent. So that's on April 6th. It is already noted in the chat feature. So if you want to jot that date down, and there will be a registration shortly in the next few days or a week on the Fort Hunter site. Fort Hunter website is also in the chat if you need to be reminded what the website is. We'll also be using the chat feature this evening as usual for the questions and answers. If you have any question that you'd like to ask Dr. Corson at the end, please write it in the chat and we will answer as many of those as time allows us to do at the end. Having said all of that, I am very, very happy to introduce to you this evening Dr. Barbara Corson, and she is going to be speaking on hoofprints in history, the role of the domestic dairy cow. Dr. Corson is a lifelong resident of this area. She is an amateur historian and a hobby farmer. She says that she is interested in highlighting the roles of cattle in history because no one else seemed to be doing it, and she thought someone should. She is a retired veterinarian from the PA Department of Agriculture who loves all kinds of animals. So I will turn it over to her.
Thank you. Can I have my first, all I see is the introductory slide.
If you want to start sharing your screen and
oh, okay. So let's see. Okay, great. First of all, I want to thank you for your interest in this presentation about the cow in history. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to talk to you about it because I really love the subject. As Dr. Barbara said, I'm a local resident and I can't seem to get my screen to my slide to advance.
are you in your PowerPoint right now?
Yes, I am. I mean, let's see here. I thought I could. I can't seem to get.
I can pull up your PowerPoint and then you can just cue me whenever you want me to click through it.
I can't seem to get this the screen. I can't when I push. There it goes. Okay. Whoops. Ah, this is
Here.
frustrating. I can't see.
I will pull up the presentation and you just cue me to switch screens and I'll do that for you then the rest of the.
Okay. I wish that I could. Okay. All right. So the second slide, please. I've always loved history and animals and farming since childhood, probably because of books like Farmer Boy. You can see an illustration there that Garth Williams drew for the book. And also artwork like this painting by Eric Sloan. And I also love nature. And it has always seemed to me that farming is part of nature if it's done right. So the next slide, please. In the 1980s, I got interested in reenacting and in living history, especially civilian life of the 18th century. And by that time, I had animals of my own, and I took them to reenactments and local historic sites. This picture is from around 1990, and it was taken at Landis Valley Museum in Lancaster. And I wanted to make a plug for the organization called ALFAM, which is the Association for Living History Farms and Agricultural Museums. When I heard about ALFAM, it seemed tailor-made for me because I was so interested in historic skills. ALFAM is dedicated to preserving historic skills, which is living history. A museum preserves artifacts or structures like buildings, but a living history site preserves historic skills. So just to give you an example, in a museum, you might see a preserved ox cart like this one in the picture. But as far as the skills of making the ox cart or the skills of training an ox to pull an ox cart, that would be the realm of a living history site. Next slide. The skills of the past are more difficult to preserve than the artifacts of the past. Historic skills are complex and they often require many moving parts. For example, if you want to preserve the skill of plowing using draft animals, it's not enough just to have a plow. You also have to have animals that are trained to pull the plow, and then you need some land and appropriate weather too, plus the knowledge of how to put all the parts together. So it's pretty hard to accomplish all that by yourself. In other words, civilization is a group activity. When I was wanting to learn some historic skills, I was lucky enough to find people who would help me. The man in the top picture was named Worth McClure. He was born in North Carolina in 1918, and he farmed all his life using oxen. He lived in Drumore, Lancaster when I knew him, Drumore, Lancaster County. And not everyone is lucky enough to live near a mentor like I was. And so that's where Alfam can come in. The lower picture shows me practicing plowing at Colonial Williamsburg. In 2008, Colonial Williamsburg hosted an international conference on oxen that drew people from all around the world to talk about preserving the skills and know-how involved with using cattle for draft. So the next slide, please. So these cows are being milked with a machine, and that might make you ask the question, how historic does a skill have to be worthy of preservation? Are these skills from 1970 historic? Well, for me personally, the thing that is worth preserving is the involvement of a human being in the process of the creation. For me, that's the difference between artisanal or individually made things or processes and industrial or mass-produced processes. So artisans or craftsmen make things by hand, and industrial processes mean that the things are made mostly by machine. I took the upper picture in the 1970s when I was working on a small dairy farm in Maine. As you can see, these cows are being milked by machine, not by hand. But compared to today, this is quite artisanal or hands-on. In this dairy, there were only about 30 cows. Someone had to physically touch each cow several times while milking her, not to mention other aspects of care like feeding and keeping the barn clean. Now look at the graph. The horizontal axis shows years between 1970 and 2017. The blue line shows the number of dairy farms in the US in thousands. And the black squares indicate the median number of cows per farm. The graph shows that since 1970, the number of dairy farms has dropped from around 650,000 to 40,000 in the United States. At the same time, the number of cows per farm has increased to where the average dairy farm now has nearly 1,000 cows. There's no way one person can take care of 1,000 cows using the skills of the past. And in the same way that there's no way to make 1,000 pairs of shoes each day using the skills of the past. To mass produce shoes or milk, you need machinery, or to use another word, technology. So the point I'm trying to make is that industrial processes are more dependent on technology and less dependent on human skills or the community. Next slide, please. The point I'm trying to make here is that as industrial processes replace artisanal ones, the artisanal skills are lost. For example, if you were trying to find somebody today who knows how to make shoes or make a barrel from wooden staves, you wouldn't be able to find somebody. And you might ask, why should we care? So what if historic skills are lost? Well, there's a lot you could say about that subject, but for our purposes here, let's just say that if history is important, and I think it is, then historic skills are important as well as artifacts. I think it's difficult to understand cultures of the past without some appreciation of the activities that made up daily life. Artifacts are a good start, especially if the item has a modern equivalent. We all wear clothes, and so we can look at this woman in the picture at the lower right And we can relate to her through her clothes. We can note how her clothes are different or similar to ours. But if you just had a milk stool or a cow neck chain by itself in a museum, that would not be enough to help you understand the activity or the process of taking care of a cow. These days, I'm happy to say there seems to be a renewed interest in local foods and skills like gardening and beekeeping, and I think small-scale dairying deserves to be remembered too. The upper picture shows a mega dairy in China, actually, making the point that technology is taking care of those cows. And the lower picture is from a Norwegian historic site, and the photographer has entitled the picture "Colleagues." I think cows were indeed colleagues and co-creators of the world we live in. And so the goal of this presentation is to highlight the fact. Next slide. Thank you. Another way to say it is that these days there's an increasing awareness of the downside of our dependence on fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are a cause of wars and climate change, but our world is so dependent on them that most of us can't really imagine life without them. But we did live for thousands and thousands of years without fossil fuels, and cows are actually a big part of how that was possible. So now let's take a look at how they did it. Next slide. First, I might establish what I mean by cow, actually. To a dairy farmer, the word cow means a mature adult female bovine, one that has had a calf. Next slide. To a dairy farmer, none of these animals is a cow. The person who owned all these animals would not say, I have 5 cows. He would say, or she would say, I have a bull, a heifer, a steer calf, and 2 oxen. But it would be true to say that each of these animals had a cow for its mother. The point is not to be annoyingly technical or fussy. The point is that each of these different animals is managed differently and used differently, and that is why they all had different names. In much the same way that native people living above the Arctic Circle had many different words for different types of snow, people in the past had many different words for different types of livestock, especially cattle. The history of farming and the history of languages are closely connected. But there is a time and place for details like this. And if you are in a car that has to swerve to avoid a large quadruped in the road, no one would fault you for saying, look out for the cow, instead of look out for that steer. No, wait, I mean, it's a heifer. In this presentation, to keep things simple, I will be using the word cow to describe domestic bovines in general. Next slide, please. As in the prehistoric cow. The wild ancestor of today's domestic cow was the Aurochs. Aurochs means primeval ox in German. The Aurochs has been extinct since the 1600s. But for millions of years before that, the species had a very wide range. That's what the map shows. The tan area is places where the Aurochs could be found living in the wild. You should note, however, that it was not present in the New World. Prehistoric humans hunted the aurochs when they were feeling brave. It was evidently a large and powerful and pretty aggressive animal. The painting in the upper left is from the Lascaux cave in France. It's estimated to have been painted around 15,000 years ago. The painting at the lower left is an artist's reconstruction. There's actually currently some interest in recreating the aurochs by combining different breeds of modern domestic cattle in the process of what's called rewilding, but that's another presentation. Let's go back to this presentation and the next slide. The aurochs is thought to be the ancestor of all these different types of domestic cattle. These are all one species, but different subtypes. And then within these subtypes, there are different breeds. So we have European cattle, Zebu cattle, and Sangha cattle. The examples of European cattle are the breeds that you're most familiar with, like Holstein, Jersey, Scotch Highland, Hereford, Angus. There are also many breeds of Zebu cattle, but they're a little bit less familiar to us, although most people have heard of Brahma cattle. Zebu cattle originated in what's now Pakistan and have spread to other warm areas, so we associate them with India. Zebu cattle have humps in which they can store fat and as an energy reserve to get them through droughts and famines. They also tend to have drooping ears and thin, redundant skin that hangs in folds. The third type of domestic cattle descended from the Aurochs are the Sangha cattle from Sub-Saharan Africa. These cattle are small and have huge horns. All of these types of cattle can interbreed easily, and all of them have been important in the history and economics of their respective regions. Next slide, please. There are other critters that are sometimes lumped together with cattle, but they are actually separate species from the domestic cow. They include the water buffalo and the yak. Water buffaloes and yaks are not descended from the aurochs. There are still wild water buffalo and there are wild yaks in small numbers. Notice that these two species of animals originated in areas that were outside the aurochs' natural range. Water buffalo are adapted to hot, wet climates, and yaks are adapted to cold, dry climates. In their respective regions, water buffalo and yaks played an analogous role to that played by the aurochs and his descendants in their regions. There are other members of the cow family tree that have never been domesticated, like the Wyson, otherwise known as the European bison, the musk ox, and the African Cape buffalo. And these animals are important parts of wild ecosystems in their native regions. The point I want to make with this slide, or one of the points, is that in all parts of the world, plants and plant-eating animals evolved together. The study of the role of large ungulates in grazing ecosystems is currently a hot topic, but that's another lecture too. So for now, back to domestic cows in history. Next slide, please. Okay, so around 8,000 BC, or around, before Common Era, BCE, wild aurochs cattle were domesticated as a source of agricultural power in the Middle East.
You're in there? Hi.
Can you still hear me? The domestication of cattle coincided with the development of the plow, cultivation of grains, and with the so-called surplus agriculture, where a human farm worker can produce more food than he or she needs to eat. Before people domesticated animals for power, there was crop farming. Crop farming can be done without animal power with hand tools, but the problem with that is that every person tilling the soil has to eat some of the harvest. So it's difficult to produce a reliable surplus. But if, on the other hand, if you have a draft animal pulling the plow, not only can you grow more grain because cattle are bigger and stronger than people, but also the draft animal doesn't have to compete with humans for the grain. Cattle can eat the straw part of the grain, and that leaves all the grain for human food. Archaeologists and anthropologists tell us that using cattle for agricultural power allowed civilization to develop.
Aaron.
And some might say for better or for worse. Before surplus agricultural developed,
Computer, I'm trying to turn it down.
Before surplus agriculture developed, pretty much everyone had to take at least some responsibility for hunting or gathering food and other necessities. With oxen performing the work, it meant that some of the people had nothing else to do but to become tax collectors or politicians. Next slide, please. Today, the word draft animal makes most people think of horses and the Budweiser Clydesdales, but the first draft animal was the ox, a bovine trained to pull. There are a couple reasons why cattle got to be the first draft animals. To harness a horse for plowing or really heavy work, you need a neck collar. And those aren't easy to make with Stone Age tools, which was all they had in 8,000 BCE. You can harness a horse with a yoke if you're going to pull something light, like a chariot, but you can't use a yoke on a horse to pull a heavy plow that's made of wood or stone. To harness an ox, you basically need some sticks and a little cordage or rope. And here you can see some oxen that have been harnessed using, very simple tools that you don't need much technology to make. Besides the fact that they're easy to harness, using cattle for agricultural power had some other advantages over using other draft animals like donkeys, camels, or horses. One of them is that cattle multiply fast. They have a shorter gestation period, than other large herbivores. A cow is pregnant for 9 months compared to 11 months in horses, 12 months in donkeys, and 14 months in camels. Cattle also mature faster than horses or donkeys or camels. Cattle can have babies earlier and they can go to work earlier. A young steer can already be working at age 1. And finally, cattle are easier to castrate than horses, donkeys, or camels. And castrated animals are generally much more docile and easier to manage. So if it wasn't easy to castrate a bull, they probably would not have been able to use an aurochs as a plow animal. Next slide, please. Thank you. Here's a few more thoughts on the comparison between horses and oxen as draft animals. Oxen are generally heavier for their height than horses are, and weight counts for a lot when it comes to heavy pulling. Horses tend to use momentum when faced with a heavy task. They jump or lunge into their work, and horses tend to get rattled if the load they are trying to move gets caught or snagged on something. Cattle, on the other hand, use torque. They tend to just lean into their work instead of lunging into it. The slow tractor-like power of oxen is well suited for really heavy, frustrating jobs like plowing ground that is full of rocks and tree roots, or for pulling stumps. Throughout history, in various different cultures, cattle provided the first agricultural power in any given area. Horses succeeded cattle as agricultural power only after the area was well settled. After a given area had developed to have well-plowed soil, good roads, and harness shops, then horses had the advantage of speed. Horses naturally walk around 4 miles per hour, and they can trot at 12 miles per hour all day if the road is good. This compares to cattle, which generally walk around 2 miles per hour. Although cattle are certainly capable of bursts of speed, they don't have the lungs or muscles for sustained speed for hours at a time. This is one reason why invading armies like Attila the Hun rode on horses rather than cattle. But I digress. The progression from, okay, next slide, thank you. Thank you. The progression from oxen to horses for agricultural power occurred around 500 Common Era in China, around 800 Common Era in Europe, and around 1500 in England. In the New World and Australia, cattle were generally on the frontier, wherever that was at a given time. This picture shows the buildings at the colonial Pennsylvania plantation near Philadelphia. The oldest buildings here were built in 1690. This area was the frontier then. And I feel sure that the stones and timbers used in the construction of those buildings were undoubtedly pulled to the site by teams of oxen. Next slide, please. Of course, it's not like all of a sudden everybody in a given area would get rid of all their oxen and switch to horses overnight. In plenty of areas, horses were used for their speed and oxen were used for their strength in the same way that farmers have tractors for some jobs and trucks or cars for other jobs. Some people just like cattle or horses best. Like today, some people like dogs and some people like cats. In the book Farmer Boy, they had both horses and cattle on Almanzo's farm. The lower right picture is another drawing from Farmer Boy and shows Almanzo training his little steers. And the book called Away Goes Sally, it tells a story of a girl whose family moved their New England house using ox teams. And the cover illustration of the book shows a team of oxen doing the tractor-like work and a horse doing the family car type work. So, but even after a given community switched completely to horsepower and gave up using oxen as draft animals, they still needed cattle. Can you guess why? Next slide, please. They needed cattle because horsepower requires leather, and you needed to have cattle in the community because although all animals have skins and you can preserve any skin and make leather if you know how, the skin of other domestic animals is too thin or too stretchy for use in harness. This horse is wearing a harness made out of cowhide, and the British Dragoons are using saddles, bridles, and pistol buckets made out of cowhide. So to to use a horse, you pretty much have to have some cowhide available in the community, as well as a harness shop. So that's one reason why you couldn't have horses as your primary source of power until the area was well settled. Leather was used to make lots of other things, all kinds of things beside horse furniture. Next slide, please. Today's synthetic materials are so easy to come by that we take them for granted, and it's hard for most of us to grasp just how important leather was. But if you look around you now, you won't see much that is made of leather, but that was not the case 100 years ago. In addition to, of course, shoes and boots, which are illustrated at the bottom in the center, leather was also used to make containers like the portmanteau at 9 o'clock, and protective clothing like the sailor's palm, which is shown at 12 o'clock in the picture, and the archer's wrist guard at around 1 o'clock. Leather was even used to make armor in ancient times. Books were once bound in leather, and heavy leather straps were used for the suspension of carriages at the lower left, and also belts like they are shown in the interior of this old mill. The belts in this picture are actually made of nylon because this is a recreated mill, but nylon wasn't invented until 1939, and it was too expensive for common use for decades after that. So every town would have had a grist mill nearby, and every grist mill would have had big leather belts like that turning the gears. Economically, leather alone was enough reason to raise cattle. One of the first things the Spanish did in the New World was establish cattle colonies in the Caribbean, from which they harvested hundreds of thousands of hides and took them back to Spain. The hides were worth enough to make the long voyage profitable. They didn't take the meat from the cattle, they just took the hides. So our list of why cattle were important is now power and leather, but cattle provided lots of other things too. Let's look at some of the other materials for civilizations provided by cows. Next slide, please. The first synthetic plastic material, Bakelite, was invented in 1907, but before that, people relied on natural plastic-like materials, and cattle provided quite a few. This slide lists 4 of them: horn and tallow and bone and hair. And again, because plastic and synthetic materials are so common today, these natural materials are unfamiliar to most of us. An effort to learn about materials of everyday life will pay off, I hope, in a deeper understanding of history. So bear with me while I talk a little bit about horn. Next slide. There are lots of misconceptions about horn, and when I take cattle to historic sites, people often focus on the horns, and we end up talking for half an hour just about horns. So I've included that in this talk. People often get horns confused with antlers. Horns are a characteristic of cattle and other related animals like antelopes, sheep, goats, and bison. In cattle, horns are not related to gender. That is, males, females, and neutered animals all have horns. And the horns are permanent. They start out as little buttons and grow throughout the animal's life. The picture in the upper left shows a 6-month-old steer with his little short horns, and in the middle is the same steer, now 7 years old. And at the far right is a 21-year-old ox whose horns have grown almost in a circle. Antlers, in contrast, are characteristic of deer. Antlers are linked to sex, and generally only males have them. They're shed every year after the breeding season. A fully formed antler is composed of solid bone, but a horn actually has 3 layers. There's bone in the center, and then soft tissue or flesh, like what is under your fingernail. And finally, an outermost layer or cover of keratin. You may recognize the word keratin as the protein that hair and nails and claws and hooves are made of. Next slide, please. So you might be asking, if horns are natural in cattle, how come none of the cows you see today have horns? The short answer is that most cattle today are either dehorned at some point in their lives, which means the tissue that knows how to produce the horn is destroyed, or else they're pawed, which means they have been selectively bred to lack the genetic information to make horns. That's a little oversimplified, but it's enough to get on with. So you can have horned cattle, you can have dehorned cattle and polled cattle. These are in the upper left is a horned cow. She's milking Devon. And in the bottom other picture is a polled Devon who has been bred for beef. So, okay, next slide, please. Although hornless animals are the default today, in nature, horns serve the animal in several ways. One, as a means of establishing dominance in the herd. Cattle are social animals and hierarchy means a lot to them. The animal with the biggest horns is often accepted as the dominant animal without any need to fight it out. Horns also serve as defense against predators. With just a quick swipe of her head, this cow could deter a wolf or a bear that was trying to get her calf. Horns are also a way the animal can regulate its internal temperature. Unlike horses, cattle don't sweat to cool themselves, but they do still have the same need to keep their blood and brain temperature under 104 degrees. Remember that I said there was there was actually flesh under the layer of keratin. The flesh is full of blood vessels, and big horns like this provide a lot of surface area for radiating heat. And even small horns are help in cooling down an overheated animal. That may be one reason why working oxen traditionally keep their horns, even when other cattle have been dehorned. It's rare to find an ox that's working that doesn't have horns. He needs the horns to cool himself off as he's working and getting hot. Although there are a few breeds of cattle that have been polled for centuries, the current default setting, as it were, of hornlessness is a modern development. I believe cattle were not systematically dehorned until the late 1800s, coinciding roughly with the development of railroads and the transportation of cattle by rail car. You can pack more hornless cows into a given space, especially if the cows you are packing are Texas Longhorns. Because dehorning is a pain, literally, the current emphasis is on breeding for the polled trait. And that can have its own unintended consequences, but again, that's a topic for another day. So for now, the point is that until fairly recently, cattle generally had horns and that horn was useful. What sort of things was horn used for? Next slide, please. The outer layer of horn can be used to make watertight containers like this powder horn. Can also be used to make cups and flasks, anything you want to use to keep wet things wet and dry things dry. It's kind of like 18th century Tupperware. The tip of the horn is solid, not hollow. And the solid part of horn can be worked to make little cases like this needle case at the bottom left. There's a little needle case that has been worked on a lathe out of horn. Or solid objects like combs. Horn can be separated into sheets that are almost transparent. Horn was at one time a substitute for glass in windows, lanterns, and they used it to make horn books. A horn book is a printed page of paper, which is mounted on a piece of wood and then covered with a clear sheet of horn to protect it. The paper was valuable, more valuable than, you couldn't just let every child have their own paper copy of the alphabet. They had to share it, and the horn laminated it, as it were. Heated horn can also be molded into shapes like these spoons and used to make horn rimmed glasses or a shoe horn. There are still people who craft things out of horn, but for us Westerners, horn is getting harder to find because the vast majority of cattle in Western countries are either polled or dehorned. You can buy lots of crafty things made out of horn online, but they're mostly made in Asia. For instance, these panes of horn that are with the candle shining through them are made in India. The next slide, please. Another thing cattle provided that is getting harder to find nowadays is tallow. And tallow is another material that is unfamiliar. What is tallow? It depends on who you ask. From the viewpoint of modern industry, tallow is a fat defined by its melting point. It is often a mix of different kinds of fats. But from a historic viewpoint, and also a biological viewpoint, tallow is the purified fat of cattle, sheep, or goats. In other words, tallow is rendered suet. Suet is the fat of ruminants, and maybe I ought to define what rendered means here, because it's another one of those words that have a lot of definitions. Rendered in this context means heated to the melting point and then strained to remove everything that is not fat, and then cooled again. And ruminants are animals, of course, that chew their cud or ruminate. And it's their unique biochemistry that is the reason that suet is chemically and physically different than the fat of animals like horses or pigs or poultry. Tallow is a saturated fat, which makes it a solid at room temperature. And that's the fact that it's saturated is also the reason it went out of favor in the late 20th century. But it may be coming back into favor, since we are now learning that synthetic hydrogenated fats and palm oil have their own detrimental characteristics. Sorry. Next slide. So these are some of the uses for tallow in the pre-petroleum years. Tallow has a high melting point and also a high smoke point compared to other fats and oils. Any fat or oil will burn, and it will give off heat and light. And any fat or oil can be used to make soap, but tallow is a solid at room temperature, which means you can use it to make candles and bar soap instead of, if you tried to make a candle out of lard, it wouldn't work. And if you use lard to make soap, you get a soft soap. So the tallow is unique that way. And like any fat, tallow, beef fat has a lot of calories. But if you live in a cold climate like Northern Europe, without any central heating, calories are what you need in order to keep working and stay warm. Recipes for famous English puddings and Christmas cake have a lot of chopped suet in them. And the high smoke point makes it useful for frying and cooking. McDonald's used tallow for French fries until the 1990s. The characteristics of tallow also made it useful for lubrication. In the days before axle grease, the wheels of freight wagons, like the famous Conestoga wagons, were greased with tallow. So that's why I have a picture of a wheel and its hub there. Tallow preserves metal surfaces like those of this flintlock pistol by repelling water. And it can be used for ointments, salves, and cosmetics. Many medicinal compounds are not soluble in water, but are soluble in fat. I have the word excipient listed on the slide. That's the name for a compound that acts as a carrier for another ingredient. So if you wanted some herbal remedy to be able to be available to the human who was using it, and it was soluble in fat, you would soak the herbal thing in hot tallow, and then it would be aided in applying it to yourself, if that makes sense. Today, thanks to petroleum, we have gotten used to having access to a world of fats and oils. We can access coconut oil and palm oil and corn oil and safflower oil and olive oil. But in the days before container ships and airplanes were commonplace, and before paraffin and Vaseline had been invented, tallow was really just about the easiest fat to get. Tallow from grass-fed cattle is about as close to solar power as you're likely to find. Next slide, please. Today, we want lean animals, cows and hogs, but in pre-petroleum times, tallow was worth as much as meat. In the 18th century, responding to a rapid increase in demand for tallow from the growing cities, farmers started breeding selectively for animals that would produce large amounts of tallow. The farmers' experiences with genetics were recorded, and they influenced Gregor Mendel, who is, of course, the father of genetics, and Charles Darwin, who would have thought that a super modern science like genetics would have had its origin in the economics of beef and mutton fat. The picture is a copy of a painting called The White Heifer That Traveled. This animal was born around 1806. And when she was mature, she was reportedly weighing about 2,300 pounds. This was at a time when many adult cows weighed less than 900 pounds. So she was quite an exceptional animal. Moving on from tallow, next slide, please. We still have to mention bone, hair, and yes, gallstones. The hair was used to strengthen clay or mortar. You may have heard of horsehair plaster. But actually, I think cow hair was used perhaps even more often. The hair in plaster is the short hair that covers the body, not the long hairs in the tail or mane of horses, although that had its uses too. The body hair was a byproduct of tanneries. And because so many cows were butchered and their hides processed into leather, it would have been easy to get plastering hair, which is listed in the ad. The newspaper ad for plastering hair is from an 1801 Philadelphia newspaper. Ridgway and Wright couriers. A courier is a person who works in leather. From my personal experience in the 1990s, my husband and I started restoring an old log house in York County that was from around 1790. And the mortar or chinking that was between the logs was just full of hair that looked exactly like the hair off of our shorthorn cattle. So besides hair, we have bone, and bone can be used to make all sorts of things, from buttons to needles and bodkins, objects of art, and knife handles. Unlike horn, bone withstands heat well. So that's why the Civil War forks have bone handles. You could leave that sitting in your skillet and it would still be easy to pick up. And bone was also dried or burned and then ground into powder to use as fertilizer. After all, there's a lot of calcium and phosphorus in bone. I'll mention a little bit more about calcium later, but for now, let's go on to the gallstones. I'm sure you're curious about that. Gallstones have been used for centuries as an aid in washing laundry because they emulsify fats. That's what they're supposed to do in the animal. And that's what they do once they're out of the animal too. It's interesting to note that today gallstones from cattle are, at the moment, they're worth more than gold ounce for ounce, not because they're used in laundry today, but because they're used in Chinese medicine. So that's why it was easy to find a picture of gallstones on the internet. And why cow gallstones? Because cows have gallbladders and not every animal does. Horses don't have gallbladders, and deer don't have gallbladders, and llamas don't either. So anyway, so far we've mentioned power, leather, horn, tallow, bone, hair, and gallstones as things that cattle contributed. But I saved the two most important things for the end. So next slide, please. Okay, milk. Today, milk is going through hard times, as my graph at the beginning pointed out. In the past 50 years or so, milk has gone from a staple of life to being considered unnecessary at best. But in history, milk has actually been really important. And I want to try to explain why I say that. Let me start by talking first about the biology of milk. Next slide. Milk production is a characteristic of female mammals. A mother mammal makes the perfect food for an infant of that species. It contains everything a newborn needs to get started in life. Because cow's milk is perfect for calves, does it necessarily follow that it's unnatural for humans to enjoy it too? I don't think so. After all, the plants that we eat are perfectly adapted to perform functions for the plant, right? It doesn't mean it's unnatural for us to eat them, does it? Do you think a carrot produces its tapered root just for your plate? If you think of it, it is actually less violent for the cow to share her milk with you than for the carrot plant to share its root with you. The carrot has to die for you to eat it. I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek here. In a way, milk is the only substance that is produced expressly to be used as food. And maybe that's why creation myths of several cultures involve cows nourishing the world with their milk. But I digress again. At any rate, next slide, please. Humans seem to have known for a long time that milk can make a good addition to the diet. The pastoral lifestyle in which humans live with and partially control the behavior of herds of hoofed animals like sheep, reindeer, or cattle. This pastoral lifestyle is older than any other type of farming. The milk of many different animals has been important in the past, but in Europe and the New World, cattle were most important because all the things we've already mentioned. You can milk a sheep, but her lamb won't pull your plow. And you can milk a horse, but a horse's hide isn't as useful as a cow hide. Another advantage of cow's milk is that its fat component rises to form cream, which can then be used to make butter. The milk from other animals, except yaks, doesn't separate quickly. The pictures illustrate pastoral lifestyles in Africa, in northern Norway, and the artist's interpretation of ancient Scythia, where mare's milk was apparently a dietary staple. Next slide, please. At first blush, it might seem strange that a step towards domestication would have been to consume milk. But from biologists' point of view, it makes sense. As you know, humans are omnivores like dogs, pigs, and bears. This means we need to consume nutrients like amino acids and vitamins that are not common, and some vitamins that are not commonly found in plants. The standard diet for an omnivore includes both plant and animal protein. As far as I know, there are no pre-industrial vegan cultures. Some of you may have read Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, which goes into this subject in greater depth and greater skill than I am. But what I'm getting at here is that for a non-vegetarian hunter-gatherer or farmer, there are other sources of animal protein besides milk, including meat and eggs. Why would you go for the milk? Well, to eat meat, you obviously have to kill the animal. And once it's dead, you have to eat it before it spoils, or you have to preserve it in some way. If you live in a warm climate, you can keep chickens and ducks and they can forage for their own feed and you can eat the eggs. But if you live in a cold climate, the poultry is going to compete with you for food. Chickens and ducks are not vegetarians. A dairy animal, a tame mother herbivore, is like a fountain of protein. In the summer, she eats grass and leaves that are growing wild. In the winter, you feed her hay and some other stored plant crop that is otherwise of no use to you. She turns the plants into babies and milk. Not only that, but the milk is easily preserved in the form of cheese and butter using only Stone Age technology. The pictures are from a living history site in Northern Europe that recreates the funnel beaker culture. The people of the funnel beaker culture were making cheese 6,000 years ago. With a tame dairy goat or cow, all you need to survive is a climate that allows for plant growth at least part of the year. Plus knowledge, of course, and some elbow grease. Next slide, please. Because humans can live pretty well on plant material with a little milk added, cows were an important part of communities for many cultures in the past. Taking care of cows was a big part of everyday life for millions of people all around the world. They didn't record a whole lot about their cows, so unless you already know how important cows were, you might miss the fact. But if you are aware that cows were fundamental in many ways, you can read between the lines, so to speak, and the history that was recorded will show that cows were there. There are lots of mentions of cow and cow products in the Bible and other sacred literature for a start. Next slide. Thanks. Although cows were mostly behind the scenes, there are some references that address the subject straight on and highlight how important dairy cattle were, and this book is one of them. It looks at how women were able to gain a degree of economic independence by making butter and selling it. To save time, I just copied the blurb about the book from the review online. And the review goes, "This is the first book to investigate the rich and complex lives of rural women during the late colonial and early national periods. The author focuses on women in the Philadelphia hinterland and shows how they became an essential part of that area's rise to agricultural prominence." So I meant to add a larger print that the author is Joan M. Jensen, and it's called Loosening the Bonds. If you're interested in history and farming, it's a great book to get. Okay, next slide, please. And this slide is to say that community cows are still important in many places around the world, wherever people live kind of off the grid without easy access to technology. For the same reason they were important in the past, they're important today. The pictures are from Mongolia, India, Nigeria, and Bolivia. They illustrate the concept that keeping a cow or two can be a way for a woman who has otherwise few resources to support themselves and her family. Next slide, please. There's still one resource that cows have provided for human, and it's a very important one: manure. Today, most people have as little to do even with the word manure. It's definitely an ooh subject for most people. But until recently, manure was not only a fact of life, it was essential resource, because manure is the key to soil fertility. I should mention at this point that the word manure used to mean anything added to the soil to improve it. Agricultural texts from the 18th and 19th century talk about manuring the land with gypsum or limestone. What we call manure used to be called dung, and it's dung to which I am referring. In talking about manure, I basically mean poop. All animals produce manure, of course, but cow manure, again, has some characteristics that make it especially desirable, if you'll allow me to use the word desirable in talking about manure. These two pictures are both by the Swedish artist Carl Larsson. The upper one is called In the Cowshed, and it was done in 1906. And the lower one is called Muckraking, and it was done in 1905. Next slide, please. This is a simplified view of what most of us call the life cycle. Even though we like to call it the life cycle, note that only half of the cycle represents life and growth. The other half represents death and decay. The decay is how elements that make up living things get returned to the soil and get turned into new living things. In nature, pretty much everything is cyclical. And here's where I get to mention calcium again. The cow's milk is full of calcium, right? That builds bones in her calf or in the humans that drink it. But the cow can only have calcium in the milk if she got it from the plants she ate. And the plants, in turn, can only contain calcium if the calcium is in the soil. So the point I want to make with this slide is that human health really depends on soil health. And soil health depends on recycling nutrients. This has been true not just since the beginning of agriculture, but since the beginning of life on Earth. But we have been able to forget about this fact for the last 100 years or so because of a world-changing event that happened around 1910. To discuss this event, I'm going to have to delve a little bit into chemistry. Next slide, please. One of the most important elements for living things is nitrogen. Nitrogen is a keystone of DNA and protein molecules in every single cell in every living thing. So without adequate nitrogen, neither plants nor animals can survive. And nitrogen is continually leaving an animal's body in the form of waste. So living things need to get additional amounts of nitrogen continually. As a gas, nitrogen is one of the most abundant elements on the planet. But as a gas, it's inert and not available to plants or animals, unless you count bacteria as animals. What this slide represents is the fact that since agriculture began, crop production depended on returning nutrients to the soil, mostly in the form of animal manure. Remember that I said that nitrogen is always leaving the body in waste, and that's where the manure comes in. If you're not going to add manure, you used to have to just find fresh, unfarmed land to farm. Next slide, please. So you had the choice of either adding manure or finding new land, but that 10,000-year-old fact of life changed in the beginning of the 20th century when Fritz Haber came up with a workaround. What Haber invented, or is at least credited with developing, is a way to take nitrogen out of the air, where, as we said, it's not available as a nutrient, and put it in the form of ammonia, which is available as a nutrient for plants if it's applied in the right amounts. Look for a moment at the equation at the top. It's important to note that you need a source of hydrogen and a source of energy, because the reaction only happens at high pressure and intense heat. Making synthetic fertilizer is not cheap. It is estimated that more than 1/3 of a modern farmer's expenses go for buying synthetic fertilizer, 1/3 of their total expense. This process was not developed or used for fertilizer at first. For the first 20 or 30 years, it was used mostly for making explosives. The two world wars created a great demand for synthetic ammonia. After the end of World War II, there was a decreased demand for explosives, but the economics made it worthwhile to promote the use of ammonia for fertilizer. When used in agriculture, synthetic ammonia provides nitrogen, and it can make a big difference in plant growth when compared with unfertilized land. The picture at the lower right shows that you get a bigger pile of corn from land that has been fertilized with ammonia compared to land that was not fertilized. Next slide. Haber's process contributed to the Green Revolution and the growth of industrial agriculture. Along with petroleum-powered tractors, synthetic fertilizer uncoupled crop farming from animal agriculture. For the first time in 10,000 years, you didn't need draft animals and you didn't need manure. You just needed enough money to buy the petroleum-based technologies that were offered to replace all the things that animals provided before. Farming is certainly different now than it was even 50 years ago. No one would say that the changes are all bad, but they're not all good either. And since few of us farm these days, few of us give much thought to the problems. But I'd like to mention one problem, and that's on the next slide. One of the problems with our current agricultural system is that synthetic fertilizers feed the plant, but they don't feed the soil. Living things are made up of more than just nitrogen, and more than just nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, which is what most synthetic fertilizers contain. When you harvest the plant, which is made up of many different compounds, and return only nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus to the soil is getting depleted of everything except nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. Modern science is only beginning to understand how complex the soil is, just as it is only recently that we've realized the existence and importance of the microbiome that influences our own individual health. There are exciting discoveries being made that show how much soil health influences everything. I thought I might mention just as an aside that organic farming is by definition trying to farm without synthetic fertilizers and without synthetic petroleum-based pesticides and herbicides. The term organic is confusing to a lot of people because it's one of those words that has different meanings depending on context. In chemistry, organic means a compound that has carbon in it. So organic chemistry is the chemistry of hydrocarbons, including petroleum. But in agriculture, organic means farming without petroleum. That's a little bit of an oversimplification, but I offer it as food for thought. Because soil health is necessary for the soil of plants, animals, and people, then manure might just be the most important reason to keep cattle around in a well-managed system. Maybe we can learn from our experiences of the past in order to improve on the past and the present. At this point, next slide, please. I want to offer a little mental exercise for you. Imagine a cord that is 100 feet long, and imagine that this cord is marked in foot-long intervals. When I give this presentation in person, I have an actual rope. And since I can't do it that way, I hope the pictures will help you get the point I want to make. So now imagine that every foot on the rope represents 100 years. So if the end of the cord here, you see it tipped in black, represents the present year of 2022, then 1 foot from the end represents 1922. And here's a hand pointing at the 1 foot mark, or if you will, 1922, which happens to be the year my father was born. So on this rope, the Norman conquest of England would have, in 1066, would be about 9.5 feet away from the present. And the birth of Jesus would be 20 feet away. The white part of the cord is 20 feet long, and that represents 2,000 years of the Common Era. The black part of the cord is 80 feet long. Next slide, please. And there's my sister standing at the other end of the 100-foot long rope. So where my sister is standing represents 8,000 BCE, when the first oxen were domesticated. And the point is that compare the length of time or cord that we have been using cattle for, as sort of fundamental in our civilization, with the less than a foot of time that our species has been dependent on petroleum for agriculture and just about everything else. And then to the right, I have listed that an awful lot of things have happened in the last foot or two. Most of the changes are in socioeconomics and technology. Now, it's these past 2 years of history that most people are interested in, and it's also the easiest history to research on your own. Just lots and lots of information available. Next slide, please. And it would be fun at this point to go into more detail on the subject of cows in recent history, and maybe in the future, someone will put together a presentation that does just that, comparing the so-called swill dairies of the 19th century, which are pictured in the upper left, with the more enlightened dairies of the early 20th century, like this milking crew at the Fort Hunter dairy in the early 1900s. And I would love to do a presentation like that, but I wanted to give this one first. It's a more basic presentation. The reason being, I think it's hard to learn details about a subject until you have a foundation to build on. Next slide, please. So much has changed that it's very hard to put ourselves back in time and really understand what life was like in the past. But because history is so important, I believe it's worth the effort to learn deeply about it. Agriculture has arguably been the single most important aspect of human civilization as far as its effect on us humans ourselves and on the planet. And until humans develop the ability to photosynthesize, it will continue to be important. And I believe the more we know about agriculture, the better for everyone. Thank you. And this is the end of the cow and of the talk.
Thank you very much for all of that information, Dr. Corson. I know we are kind of a couple minutes over and I don't see any questions if, you know, that anybody had put in. So you covered everything everybody wanted to know, apparently.
Probably everybody fell asleep or couldn't follow me. It took me a little bit longer than I did when I went to a practice run of it. I could hear somebody else talking and that kind of rattled me a little bit, but
I don't know what that was. I kept clicking, you know, and it kept going on. I apologize for that.
That's all right. I mean, if I was a little bit more poised, it wouldn't have rattled me at all, but
no, it's fine.
At any rate,
Gremlins in the room, who knows?
That's
But
great.
thank you again. This will be available in a few days on the Fort Hunter website. You know, we have somebody saying thank you very much, how interesting this was, and I think we all agree with that sentiment. And you know, there may well be a invitation in the future for the part 2 on, you know, how did they milk those cows in the Centennial Barn?
That's right. Yes.
Lots of people saying thank you, very interesting, learned a lot. So
that's nice.
You know, it's absolutely fabulous. I do want to know if this your cow is the last picture.
That was the first cow I ever brought to Fort Hunter, Rose. Her name was Rose.
But
that
again,
picture is from the 1990s.
Well, lovely cow.
Yes, it was a good cow.
Thank you again very much. I see a lot of people saying interesting, so I think
yes.
You know, wait for an email from me to come back next year sometime. And
okay, that'd be great.
Thank you everyone
Wonderful.
for joining us, and don't forget
Yes.
to join us on April 6th for pre-colonial Pennsylvania. And thank you very much and have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
All right, I'm going to end the meeting now.